she wants to follow along.
I shared the presentation in Arabic, English with Russia, but it's good to have some comments.
Yeah, no, perfect.
Please.
Okay, so I would like to share my screen, and we can jump right in. So I'm gonna do. Okay, sorry, from the beginning. All right. Greetings again, everybody. It's really great to be here with you and to share this new way of thinking about how to view violence. So we'll skip to the next thing. So as you know, URI has three main purpose areas. The first and foremost, and what's at the core of everything that URI does, is to promote daily, enduring interfaith cooperation. The second purpose area of URI is to end religiously motivated violence. But I do want to point out that we believe that faith actors have the role to play in interrupting and stopping all forms of violence, not just religiously motivated violence, and that URI has made a decision that it's not going to focus exclusively on religiously motivated violence, but trying to prevent all kinds of violence against people, but also against the environment. And then the third purpose area of URI is create cultures of peace, justice, and healing. So I'll let Rasha translate.
اوكي. هو البرزنتيشن ظاهر جدا فيه اللي هو العربي. فأنا في الأول خالص هي بتتكلم عن تطبيق المدخل الصحي للحد من التطرف بدافع دينية. فهي قالت إن احنا هنتعامل من خلال ثلاث مستويات، اللي هي خلق ثقافة السلام والعدالة وتضميد الجراح، ده على المستوى الثقافي. والتاني إنهاء التطرف بدوافع دينية، وده مستوى يعني مستوى ممنهج. وتعزيز التعاون المستمر بشكل يومي للأديان على الانتربيرسونال أو المستوى الشخصي. أنا يعني كده هنترجم يعني سلايد باي سلايد أو جزء جزء. فأنا هستناه يعني يعني بيت باي بيت كده، انا بعدها هبقى بترجم. ف كارين اتفضلي وانا هبقى بترجم وراكي. بس please speak slowly. Karim, please go ahead and I will please speak slowly so that I can translate.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that reminder. Are we ready to move to the next slide? You've done this translation. Okay. So this health approach to violence prevention is based on an approach that was created by Dr. Gary Slutkin, who is the founder of Cure Violence Global, the organization where I used to work. And you can read more about Cure Violence Global and their work at the website address on the screen.
اوكي، السلايد دي هي زي ما مكتوبه بالظبط كده. يعني هي هتتكلم المنهج اللي هي بتتكلم عليه لتناول للحد من العنف. زي الترجمه المكتوبه بالظبط لمنع العنف للمنهج اللي حطته الدكتوره جراي. هي بتقول انها كمان في معلومات اكتر على الويب سايت اللي مكتوب. الويب سايت بعنوان Cure Violence Global. اوكي.
So this approach has been used in lots of different settings, lots of different countries. It's primarily known for the work that they've done in the United States and Latin America, which is focused on preventing community violence. But as you'll see from the map, they did other programs in other places, including in Syria. That was 2017 to 2019, actually, in Iraq from 2008 to 2013, and other places, as you'll see on the map.
المنهج ده تم تطبيقه في العديد من الأماكن في أوضاع مختلفة. هي أكتر هتتناول عن اللي تم التأطير و2018 ل 2020. اوكي.
In all of these cases, we saw reductions in violence, actual reductions in violence, with fewer people being harmed or killed as a result of violence. And it can work in lots of different kinds of contexts. So the program in England, for example, was done exclusively in a prison, a youth detention center. And it was focused on reducing violence within that youth detention center. So it can be adapted to different contexts as depending on what you're trying to reduce and the kind of violence you're trying to reduce.
Okay, so can you be a little slower? هي بتتكلم عن المنهج اللي تم تبنيه لتقليل العنف، تم تطبيقه في العديد من الحالات الخاصة بالقتل أو الخاصة بتعرض الناس لإصابات مختلفة. كمان هي اتكلمت على إنه كمان تم تطبيقه في إنجلترا في اللي هي المراكز الخاصة بالاحتجاز فيها. لما تم تبني المنهج ده فلاحظوا ان في تقليل من الحالات اللي فيها عنف او قتل في مراكز الاعتقال. اوكي.
So the health approach to violence prevention looks at violence as an epidemic health problem. So it looks at it as a contagious, as if the same way that the WHO looks at the spread of contagious diseases. And if you look at it that way, then it can be treated with a health approach. And that's what we're about to talk about.
تمام. يتم معاملة العنف على إنه مشكلة صحية وبائية. هذه إذا تناولنا العنف من هذا المنهج على إنه مرض معدي، فهذا المرض المعدي يمكن معالجته واحتوائه.
Okay. So what is a health approach? A health approach views violence first and foremost as a behavior. So it's about a bad behavior, not about a bad person. And just that framing alone really changes how you think about interrupting and stopping violence.
ما هو دي التعريف للمنهج الصحي. فهو العنف هو عبارة عن سلوك سيء، هو سلوك سيء وليس شخص سيء، يتم انتشار هذا السلوك بين الأشخاص.
The second big part of the health approach is that it's a behavior that can be prevented or changed, right? So violence is a behavior that can be prevented and which spreads in a contagious manner.
الجزء الثاني ان يمكن منع اذا عرفناه على انه السلوك معدي، فهو قابل لانه ينتشر بشكل كانه عمليه معديه.
Fortunately, there's a lot of science that can be applied to trying to interrupt and stop the spread of violence. Epidemiology, which focuses on stopping the spread of contagious diseases. Behavior change, science of behavior change. Neuroscience, and we'll get to why that's important in a second. And there's a fourth one that I'm not remembering right now, but there's plenty of different sciences behind this approach to interrupting and stopping violence.
هناك الكثير من الجانب العلمي في هذا التناول أو في هذا المنهاج. فهو على المستوى العلمي يمكن تعريفه على إنه سلوك أو ينتشر، وهو ليه جزء على الجانب السلوك العصبي يتم. وهناك الكثير من الدراسات اللي تم تناولت هذا الموضوع فتناوله كنهج يتم كمرض يتم انتشاره. اوكي.
People can be exposed to violence in lots of different ways. So when you're thinking about interrupting and stopping violence, you have to think about what is the way in which they're being exposed to violence. How is the violence showing up for that people, or in the case where you live, where do you see violence? Where do you feel like it's the biggest problem? And that's where you'll want to focus. So it can be applied to all kinds of violence, and you focus it and you adapt it based on the kind of violence that you're trying to end. Okay, Rasha, were you done with that translation?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you witness violence, it also has an impact on you. So if you think about children who grow up in a violent household, they are exposed to violence, even if they're not themselves the victims of that violence. And that exposure also has an impact on them as they're growing. And there's a lot of science studies that have been done about how exposure to violence, whether they've experienced it or just witnessed it, how that shows up in life later in their behaviors and in their mental health.
زي ما كنا بنقول ان الاسهم فيها كلمه witness وكلمه victim، فهي كمان بتقول ان التعرض للعنف وليس انك تبقى ليس ان يكون الشخص ضحيه للعنف ليه اثار عليه. هناك في دراسات كتير اتعملت على ان الاطفال عندما يتعرضوا للعنف وليسوا عندما يشاهدوه حتى على التلفاز او في وسائل الميديا وهم ليسوا ضحايا له، فده له تأثير كبير على صحتهم النفسية والعقلية. وهناك العديد من الدراسات العلمية اللي قاموا بها وأثبتت إن في آثار جانبية على المستوى الصحي والمستوى السلوكي والمستوى الذهني المستوى النفسي.
But not everybody who's exposed to violence actually becomes violent.
ليس كل شخص يتعرض للعنف يصبح شخصا عنيفا.
And this is where a lot of the other programs that URI does come into play. They're very important in building up the resilience of individuals and to show them a different way of life. And that helps them become less susceptible to becoming violent as a result of experiencing violence or witnessing violence.
Okay, I didn't get it.
So
However,
the program
ليس كل زي ما قلت ليس كل ما تعرض للعنف ولكن عرضة تعرض الشخص للعنف ليس تختلف من شخص لشخص. فهناك أشخاص عندهم صمود نفسي أكبر تجاه التعرض للعنف. Okay.
So let's look for a second at this idea that violence is contagious. Okay, so this idea that violence is contagious is not something that was just made up. It's something that has been studied extensively. In 2013, there was a workshop that was held by the Institute of Medicine in Washington, D.C. And at that workshop, there were scientists from different fields: epidemiology, neuroscientists, social scientists, anthropologists. They all came and they all presented their studies of how violence, the ways in which violence is contagious. And that workshop summary, which you see a picture of the cover of on the slide, is available if you Google online Contagion of Violence Institute of Medicine. Maybe Laura can find it and put the link, well, if it's necessary, or send it out later.
تمام. يعني نتعامل مع العنف كمرض معدي. ليس التعامل مع العنف كمرض معدي ليست مختلقة، لكن كان بتتكلم عن ان كان في دورة، كان في وركشوب في 2013 في واشنطن دي سي، كان في يحضرها هذه الدورة الكثير من العلماء في مختلف المجالات، الأعصاب والأنثروبولوجي وعلم الاجتماع وغيرها. وكانت خلاصة ما خرجوا به من هذه الدورة التدريبية هذه السلايد، الشريحة اللي هنقولها دلوقتي، على إن العنف يعامل كمرض معدي. Okay, Karen, go ahead, proceed.
Okay, so the World Health Organization defines violence in different, the words that they use is that it clusters, it spreads, and it has transmission. So these are the things that we're going to look at on the next slides.
تمام. منظمة الصحة العالمية عرفت العنف وتناولته كمرض معدي من خلال 3 نقاط، اللي هي الكلاسترنج، التكتل أو الأشكال العنقودية، والانتشار والانتقال، وده اللي هنتناوله في الشريحة اللي جاية بعد كده في العرض. Okay.
So violence clusters like a disease, as you see on the top left. So you have cholera, which shows up in clusters where the red dots are. And then that's in, I think, maybe Bangladesh, but I'm not sure. And then you see the city of Chicago and how violence clusters, again, the red dots. So it's not everywhere evenly, it clusters in specific spots. And so that's one of the ways in which violence acts like a disease. And it shows this. And this is true in your own communities. If you think about it, violence doesn't happen everywhere. It happens in very specific locations and they can be identified.
العنف بينتشر زي كتكتل مرضي او على شكل عناقيد. فهنا هي بتقارن بين العنف والامراض. فالعنف هنا الكوليرا والفايلنس، فالعنف بينتشر بنفس الطريقه اللي بينتشر بيها مرض او وباء. بتتكلم على انتشار ان العنف لا يكون في كل مكان، ولكن بينتشر بطريقه تكتليه، زي الصورة الموضحة على الشمال. ده تقريبا الانتشار العنف في شيكاغو.
And then we also see that violence spreads in the same way that a disease does. It's not linear. Like if you look at the influenza, it spreads in waves. And you look at the curves of the influenza graph, and then you look at the curves of violence. So that also is another way in which it looks, looking at the data, we can see that it acts like a contagious process.
وفي عملية انتشار العنف تشبه عملية انتشار المرض، بتقول نفس الكلام. زي برضو لما نبص لمرض الانفلونزا ونبص على العنف، لما نشوف الرسم الموجود في البرزنتيشن هنلاقي ان هو يعني طريقة انتشار مماثلة جدا لانتشار المرض.
And we know that violence also transmits from person to person through exposure, modeling, social learning, and norms.
بالظبط. وينتشر برضو العنف، ينتشر أو ينتقل من شخص لآخر من خلال السوشيال، من خلال النمذجة والتعلم الاجتماعي والأعراف.
So how does this transmission happen? So not on the slide, Rasha, but I'm just explaining in a gastrointestinal disease, like if you get sick, like from eating some bad food, that transmission. What happens is it goes into your stomach and your stomach gets sick. So it goes in through the mouth and you get sick in your stomach, right? But with violence, the transmission happens in the brain, right? So by observing violence or by experiencing violence themselves, being a victim of violence. And different parts of the brain are affected depending on when you were exposed to violence, whether it was like you were a victim of violence or a witness of violence, etc.
العنف شبهناه قبل كده في انتقاله زي انتقال الأمراض، زي ما بيحصل إنك بتاكل حاجة مش كويسة ومعدتك بعد كده بتألمك. نفس الكلام بيحصل في العنف. العنف بينتقل من برضو إذا كان الشخص بينتقل في الدماغ من خلال مشاهدة العنف أو التعرض للعنف، الجزء المصاب بيكون في الدماغ على حسب انت كنت ضحية للعنف او كنت بس بتشاهد العنف. Okay.
But there are a lot of factors that modulate, that impact how much exposure to violence impacts a person, right? So the age at which they are witnessing or experiencing violence, whether or not they've had some sort of prior immunity, in this case, maybe the community resilience work that a lot of URICCs are doing contributes to that prior immunity, the type of exposure, how much violence did they witness or experience, the context in which it happened, etc. These are all called modulating factors, and they apply for contagious diseases the same as they apply for the spread of violence.
هناك العوامل الكثيرة بتحدد يعني مدى الإصابة بالعنف أو مدى انتقال العنف ليك، سواء إذا كنت برضو إذا كنت ضحية العنف أو واقع عليك العنف، إذا كان إيه عمرك، إذا كان إيه عملك، إذا كنت مثلا جزء من الدوائر URI وليك عمل جوه، ليك عمل بيعالج أو بيساعد على تقليل العنف، ونوع تعرضك للعنف، خبرتك فيه، ماذا حصل، ايه النمذجة الموجودة. فهي كل العوامل دي عوامل قد تؤدي إلى تعديل انتشار العنف أو انتقال العنف، السياق اللي انتقل فيه العنف والجرعة العنف اللي انت تعرضت لها أو شاهدتها، كل دي من العوامل. Okay.
Thank you. One of the studies that I found most interesting in that workshop on the contagion of violence had to do with a study that looked at the feeling of social exclusion. So when somebody feels like they're being excluded from a group, that feeling of social exclusion shows up in the pain center of the brain. So that's really powerful. We don't treat it like it's painful, right? We treat it as we really just don't think about that. But for the person, it's their brain is telling them that they're in pain and they're experiencing pain the same way they would if they had a physical injury. And so it's a very powerful thing, this feeling of social exclusion. And that's why programming that focuses on including people and making sure that people feel included are so important.
واحدة من المعلومات اللي كانت بالنسبة لها مثيرة للاهتمام هي إذا عندما يتم إقصاء فرد في المجتمع. لا، عندما يتم إقصاء فرد في المجتمع فهذا الفرد بيتعرض لإصابة أو بينتقل هذا الإحساس للدماغ، فبيشعر بالألم. ففهم المخ لهذا الألم نتيجة لإقصائه في المجتمع. فدي كانت من أحد النقاط المهمة في الدورة، بتقول إنها إقصاء الشخص في المجتمع شيء مؤلم لدرجة إن الدماغ، جزء من الدماغ بيصاب فيه بالتألم.
And the reason I think this is important for us looking at violence is that we've seen lots of incidents when somebody says that the reason they did violence or the reason they joined an extremist group was because they felt socially excluded. So it's important as part of preventing violence to be aware of that connection and be aware of exactly what's happening when somebody feels socially excluded.
من الأسباب الكتيرة لمشاركة الأشخاص في إن هم يقوموا بالعنف كتير جدا، لقوها إن تعرض الأشخاص للإقصاء في المجتمع. فإحنا لازم نحط في اعتبارنا جدا إن من أهم أسباب انتشار العنف، ومن أهم الأسباب اللي إحنا ممكن نستخدمها علشان نمنع انتشار العنف هي عدم إقصاء الأفراد في المجتمع. Okay.
So fortunately, we know a lot about how violence, how behaviors are acquired, maintained, and changed. Do you want to just do that, or?
Yeah. من سوء الحظ ان في طبعا في جوه المجتمع السلوكيات بتؤدي لانتشار العنف او انتقال العنف.
So up until the age of 10 or 12, behaviors are acquired and maintained or changed primarily through imitation and modeling, as you'll see in the top left. That boy walking behind the two men has no idea why he's walking with his hands behind his back. He's doing it because the two men are doing it.
تمام. من انتقال العنف، من مثلا بنلاحظ في الاطفال من 10 ل 12 سنه هم بيقوموا بالتقليد او ان يبقى او النمذجه. فهم زي ما انتم شايفين في الصوره الاولانيه كده ان الولد الصغير ده ماشي وراهم حاطط ايده ورا ظهره ومش عارف هو بيعمل كده ليه. فالاطفال في السن ده بيميلوا اكتر لان هم يقلدوا اللي بيشوفوه.
But after the age of 10 or 12, so approximately when adolescence sets in, peer pressure becomes much more important in acquiring and maintaining and changing behaviors. People are more likely to do what they think is expected of them by their close friends. And this is important because that's what we need to focus on in terms of trying to change behaviors, and recognizing that people care about the views of people who are close to them and who they view as credible and trustworthy. So it's not always the people we think they would find credible or trustworthy. It's really people from within their own group who they know and trust. And that's something we need to focus on and think about when we're designing programming aimed at trying to interrupt and stop violence.
بعد ما يبقى الطفل بعد سن 10 12 سنة هو بعد ما يبقى عدى المرحلة دي بيكون عليه ضغط انه يبقى بيتعلم او يكتسب مهارات ويغير السلوك. من الحاجات يعني وجدوا ان الضغط اللي بيمارسه الأصدقاء على أصدقائهم في ان هم يغيروا سلوكهم او يتبنوا سلوك معين، فدي من الحاجات اللي قد تساهم في الانتقال العنف او في ان الطفل او الاقرناء يتبنوا العنف نتيجه للاشخاص دايره الثقه حواليهم او الاصدقاء المقربين. فمن ضمن الاشياء اللي احنا لازم نحطها في اعتبارنا واحنا بننفذ برامج لتقليل العنف هي برضو كمان البيئه المحيطه او الاقرناء او الدايره القريبه من الاشخاص او من الاطفال. Okay.
But there are neurological effects that once they happen, it's very hard to undo them. So it's really important to try to prevent violence before it happens in order to prevent those neurological changes that take place when somebody is directly impacted by violence or witnesses is exposed to violence.
التأثيرات العصبية لما بتحصل أو يعني إنها لما بتحصل صعبة بعد كده تتمنع، فالأسهل إن إحنا نمنع التأثيرات العصبية من الحدوث أصلا، فده يقلل التأثير عليها.
And the more that can be done to build up those protective factors around everybody within your community. So building community resilience, the better it is in trying to reduce the impact of that exposure to violence. And that's what is called here modulation factors.
من العوامل اللي هي التعديل ان آم، آه، ان ن- آه، في ان احنا نبني او نزود الصمود المجتمعي. فهو دي من الاثار اللي احنا لو عملناها افضل بكتير من ان احنا نبقى بنقلل التعرض للعنف. تاثير ان يبقى في صمود مجتمعي او بناء صمود مجتمعي في المجتمع احسن بكتير من تقليل التعرض للعنف او مشاهده العنف.
So fortunately, the World Health Organization has been interrupting and stopping the spread of contagious diseases for decades. And they have a process that they've been using that works to do this. This same process can be used to interrupt and stop the spread of violence. It has three main components: interrupt transmission, prevent the future spread, and change the group norms. And we're going to talk about all of these further on in the presentation.
منظمة الصحة العالمية فيما يتعلق بإن يعني إنها إيقاف الأوبئة كان ليها 3 منهجيات اللي هي هنتكلم عليها. إحنا لأننا بنعامل العنف كأنه مرض معدي أو وباء، فهي نفس الفكرة. أول حاجة إعاقة الانتقال ومنع الانتشار، وطبعا تغيير الأعراف أو المعايير المجتمعية.
So the public health approach has a lot of benefits or that make it a good approach. So it focuses on detecting events early, preventing the spread. It works within the community. It's inherently grassroots and local, right? It focuses on reaching the people who are hardest to reach. It focuses on changing behavior, so you have that long-term change. It focuses on changing the norms. And one thing to know is that in contexts where you have high levels of violence, the norms have changed such that violence has become normal. So it's important to change those norms, right? And it focuses very specifically on trying to prevent violence and not doing a bunch of other things. And that's what a public health approach brings.
النهج الصحي الخاص بالعنف، احنا بتتكلم على ان في الاستراتيجيات زي ما تبنتها منظمة الصحة العالمية، فيها اكتشاف الاحداث مبكرا ومنع انتشارها، ومنع انتشارها على المستوى الجراس روتس او المستوى الشعبي او المستوى على مستوى الاشخاص بشكل اوسع، والعمل مع المجتمع بطريقه مقبوله، الوصول لاصعب ما يمكن الوصول اليه، وبعد كده تغيير السلوكيات والتصرفات، وتغيير الاعراف. احيانا بيكون في تغيير الاعراف ان العنف اتغير وبقى مقبول، بقى سلوك مقبول. ففي النقطة دي تغيير الأعراف بيكون مهم جدا. تاني حاجة التركيز، آخر حاجة التركيز، وده طبعا اللي هو نهج الصحة الشعبي، الصحة العامة اللي هو على المستوى الجراس روت أو المستوى الشعبي. Okay.
So the three components of a health approach then are to detect and interrupt the violence before it happens. So really think about when violence might happen or is happening and try to prevent it from happening or try to prevent it from spreading, right? That's detect and interrupt. That's the first component of the health approach. The second.
أول مكون اوكي
Yeah, go
اول
ahead.
مكون اللي هو يعني اول مكون اكتشف ووقف. اول مكون اكتشف قبل حدوث العنف، وامنع حدوث العنف. ففي حاله اننا بنمنع حدوثه ونكتشفه مبكرا، ده منهج مهم جدا من المناهج ال3 لوقف او للحد من العنف.
The second component is to focus on changing the behavior of the highest risk. So you don't need to try to change everyone's behavior. You want to think about who's doing the violence or who's most likely to be doing the violence and work on changing the behavior of those people, the behavior of violence.
اوكي، المكون الثاني هو تغيير السلوك ذو الخطر المرتفع. هو احنا مش هنغير سلوك المجتمع كله، ولكن احنا هنبص على مين، او سوف نلقي نظرة على من يقوم بالعنف، مين الاشخاص القائمين بالعنف، مين الاشخاص المعرضين بشكل اكبر للعنف، وفي الحالة دي هنشتغل على اننا بنغير هذا السلوك. اوكي.
And as I said a moment ago, in places where you have very high levels of violence, it's become normal. The norms have changed such that people have begun to accept a certain amount of violence or expect a certain amount of violence and think that either that there's nothing that can be done about it, or they just don't, they just accept it. You know, like, oh, okay, this is how life is. But we are encouraging you to not just accept violence, and we're encouraging people to think about how to change those norms that are so accepting of violence in these communities and try to work on changing behaviors by changing norms.
اتكلمت قبل دقيقة على الأماكن اللي بيبقى فيها مستويات عالية من العنف، إن إزاي جوه المجتمع الأعراف تقبلوا العنف بطريقة إن هم خلاص ما بقوش شايفين إن في مشكلة مع العنف، أو إن هم شايفين إن ما فيش حاجة تقدر تغيره. فده دورنا إن إحنا نشتغل على إن المجتمع ما يتقبلش العنف، وطالما غيرنا السلوك الأعراف جوه المجتمع نقدر نغير طريقة تقبلهم للعنف، أو نقدر نحد من انتشار العنف.
And another word for norms might be common beliefs or common views that people hold. That would be another way to talk about norms in the community.
Okay, could you say it again? Sorry, I didn't got it.
So I don't know. I was saying another way to think about norms is to think about it as views that are commonly held or beliefs that are commonly held within a community. So that's what we mean when we say norms.
في طريقة تاني، احنا لسه بنتكلم على الأعراف، إن احنا نستخدم I don't know how to translate it. طريقة okay. Sorry,
okay.
I didn't get it.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, thank you. So what does it mean to detect and interrupt? First and foremost, you need to think about where the violence is happening and about how it can be interrupted.
هنتكلم على أول مكون اللي هو إزاي تتحرى وتكتشف العنف، وإزاي أين يحدث وكيف يمكن إيقافه. Okay.
So the people who can interrupt violence are people who come from the same group, are close friends with, trusted by the people who are doing the violence. So you really need to think about who's doing the violence and who can reach those people. So their criteria for figuring this out is first figure out who's doing the violence and who do you need to reach, and then think about who do they know and trust, and which of those people would be willing to, is already interested in trying to interrupt and stop violence. So you look for the people who are already themselves have shown that they don't like the violence and they want it to stop. And then you work with those people to reach the people who are doing the violence. So there's a way of analyzing the situation, first starting with who's doing the violence, and then who do they trust? How do you reach those people? And then working with those people who can reach them. So it's not that people like me and you can go to somebody who's doing violence and talk them out of doing that violence. We have to figure out who has that credibility and trust, and how do we get them to use that credibility and trust to get those people to stop that behavior of violence and to change that behavior of violence.
بالنسبة للأشخاص اللي هم القادرين على إيقاف العنف، إحنا ليهم معايير خاصة إن هم لازم يكونوا من داخل المجموعة، ولازم يكونوا هم عندهم الإرادة لوقف هذا العنف، وكمان ليهم القدرة والوصول على والمصداقية على إحداث هذا التغيير. إحنا مش لازم يعني مش أي حد يقدر أو له قدرة على وقف العنف أو يعمل على هذا الموضوع. في الأول لازم من تحليل الموقف لازم نشوف مين هم أصلا القائمين بالعنف، مين المجموعة القائمة بالعنف، مين الناس كمان اللي تقدر توصل وتدخل جوه هذه المجموعة قادرة على الوصول وقادرة وكمان ترغب في إحداث تغيير إيقاف العنف. كمان لابد من أن يتمتع هؤلاء القائمين على إحداث هذا التغيير ببعض المعايير اللي هي من ضمنها ان هم ليهم المصداقيه واهل الثقه، وكمان عندهم النيه لاحداث هذا التغيير، تقليل السلوك العنيف، وطبعا تقليل العنف بشكل عام داخل هذه المجموعات التي تتبنى السلوك العنيف. اوكي تمام.
So I just put this here as a light way of just breaking up the slide deck. So you see how violence transmits from person to person. The gentleman gets yelled at work. He goes home and he complains to his wife and yells at her because his sock apparently has a hole in it. Then she goes and she yells at the boy, and then the boy goes and yells at the cat. It's just a light-hearted way of showing how violence can transmit from person to person with
تمام. في السلايد دي زي ما انتم شايفين ازاي العنف ممكن ينتقل من شخص لاخر. في اول صوره ازاي المدير بيزعق للموظف، وبعد كده هو روح بيته فبيتخانق مع مراته على الشراب، وبعدين هي راحت زعقت في ابنها وابنها راح زعق في القط. فالعنف بينتقل فعلا من شخص لاخر زي السلايد بالظبط.
So we talked about interrupting and stopping violence before it happens. Now we're going to look at behavior change. So when you're thinking about behavior change, you want to think about those people who are at the highest risk for doing violence. So people who are doing violence or at high risk for doing violence. And you want to focus on trying to change that behavior of violence, change their thinking about the acceptability of using violence to achieve a goal or to address a grievance, right? So this second part of the health approach looks at this changing the behavior of violence by changing the way they think about the acceptability of using violence to achieve goals or to address a grievance.
اتكلمنا في المرة الأولى عن ازاي نعرف العنف ونوقفه. المرة دي هنتكلم عن تغيير السلوك. احنا بنتكلم عن هنا في المكون الثاني عن تحديد الأشخاص اللي هم الأكثر عرضة للعنف. هنعمل على تغيير سلوكهم، العمل على تغيير السلوك من خلال العمل على تغيير طريقة التفكير. ان احنا نشتغل ازاي نخلي الناس تغير طريقة تفكيرها وتقبلها للعنف على انه وسيلة لتحقيق أهدافها أو وسيلة للوصول إلى معالجة لمشاكلها. فإذا اشتغلنا على الطريقة اللي بيتقبل بيها الأشخاص دول للعنف، فدي فكده من خلال هذا العمل قد نصل إلى تغيير السلوك. Okay.
And then the third part of the health approach is to look at the norms in the community, the beliefs in the community that exist that support the use of violence, right? So in places where you have high levels of violence, usually the norms related to violence, the beliefs about violence have changed to the point where it's become normal or accepted that violence will happen. And so the third part of the health approach focuses on changing those community norms so that people no longer view violence as something that is inevitable that they cannot stop.
تمام. المكون الثالث هو تغيير الأعراف المرتبطة بالعنف، الأعراف الموجودة في المجتمع في الأماكن التي يظهر بها عنف بشكل كبير. فالمكون بيتناول على كيفية تغيير الأعراف حتى يصبح العنف غير مقبول. يعتبر أعراف المجتمع إنه إزاي نغير هؤلاء، إزاي نغير الأعراف جوه المجتمع بحيث المجتمع لا يصبح لا يتقبل العنف.
And it's our belief that the members of URI who have been practicing interfaith cooperation and promoting cultures of peace, justice, and healing are well positioned to change norms in their community related to violence.
اعتقادنا، أنا طبعا بنعتقد جميعا أن أعضاء URI من خلال أعمالهم وممارستهم وتعاونهم بين الأديان، ومن خلال طبعا ممارسة من خلال عملهم وتبنيهم ثقافة السلام وتبنيهم ثقافة الحوار ما بين الأديان، عندهم مقدرة كبيرة على أن هم يتبنوا هذا الموضوع ويغيروا طبعا الأعراف الموجودة جوه مجتمعاتهم.
All right, so I'm reminded that we have only 30 minutes left and I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to skip some of the slides here that we don't need, so I'm going to skip the slide. All right, so we're ready for a discussion. So this is the health approach to violence prevention. And we are very interested in having a conversation now for the next 30 minutes about the applicability. Is this health approach, do you feel that it is something that can be used in your communities to interrupt and stop violence? And what of this makes sense to you or resonates with you, and what doesn't, right? And do you believe that you or your members of the URI network could be key influences in this area of interrupting and stopping violence? So these are the kinds of questions that we want to discuss. I don't think we need to leave the slide up, but I'll let you translate that and then we'll go to a discussion.
Okay. دي أسئلة. الأسئلة فيما يتعلق بالمنهج الصحي الخاص بوقف العنف، مدى إمكانية تطبيق المنهج الصحي في مختلف السياقات. What of the resonates with you? ما هو المعقول بالنسبة لك؟ ما ليس مقبولا؟ هل أعضاء شبكات URI بالفعل مؤثرين رئيسيين؟ كيف يمكن مجموعات دوائر التعاون أن تشارك في منع العنف؟
So I want to stop sharing now and go to a discussion. Does that sound good?
دلوقتي عندنا المناقشات.
Okay. So I am very curious to hear your reactions and your thoughts to what we've just discussed. And I don't know if Mamoun or Laura, if one of you want to moderate this or how you want to handle it.
I can do that for sure. Thank you very much, Karen, for the very interesting presentation. And also I liked your slides because they were very structured. So whoever has a question or comment, you can raise your emoji hand, or as Dr. Taleb, just the real hand.
Yes.
Go
I would
ahead.
like, it's not only a question, it is what we are now seeing of genocide going on in Gaza and also in Palestine here. We are really under very harsh conditions, and this or these massacres and these killings are justified by Jewish religious Zionists there are good Jews, but there are Zionist Jews who use or misuse the religion to commit these massacres. This is the thing that is very, very bad to hear this and to see that URI has not intervened or had just not issued any article or any, let us say, any condemnation of what is going on. That is very bad.
Okay,
أنا بحب أترجم نفسي.
thank you. Okay, any other comments or questions, or maybe you would like to relate to the questions proposed by Karen? Any questions here in the office?
Maybe not a question. I opened up my account, but very interesting what to say it, and especially like the point of view.
كيفك يا عمر؟
Shall I speak louder?
Okay.
دكتور طالب هلا حبيبي.
كيفك يا رشا؟ يعطيك العافية، سلمي على مصر. بلاش شد حيلها معنا شوية مصر يا يلا معلش.
Yes.
Especially like that it's most countries start at the like very area next to persons and make it very small and go
يا
from
داني.
Jesus Christ, and go to bigger steps. And especially the thing you said with religious leaders, that they can have a big impact on the prevention of violence at youth. This is also interesting, and I would like to know how, I don't know, the CCs or you guess this could be possible or managed, that we get religious leaders from communities into the boat, and that, for example.
Omar?
Yes. Thank you, Karen, very much for this nice presentation. I think this is a very rich presentation. In my opinion, to prevent the violence, we have to start from the beginning, from the base. From my point of view, the base is the educational system in the community. So we can't deal with preventing violence by going to the individuals or to some communities directly without establishing this strong base, which is, you know, the educational system, which includes the schools, the universities, and what these educational system in their messages and their curriculum include. As you know, we saw many educational systems which encourage others, encourage their students or their kids, for example, to hate the others or to hate specific groups in this world or in this region. So we have to be careful about the educational issues, because everything comes from education. The school part of the educational system, the media part of the educational system, the family part of the educational system. So what we see is as a result of what they have from this system, how they teach him to hate or to love. They teach him to be good to others or to be aggressive. So this is very important issue from point of view. I think before doing anything, we have to look to this educational system which, you know, which support the violence or prevent the violence. I saw some educational system around us encourage the kids to hate others in a very, very, very aggressive way. So how come we will ask them to be nice to others and they established and raised to be aggressive or violent to others? This is my point of view.
So let me take some of these before we then go to the others. I'll start with that, Omar. I absolutely agree that education is important, early childhood education and further on up. I would say yes, and not that has to happen and only that and nothing else, because if we don't interrupt violence in the moment when it's happening, then people will be exposed to violence and it will be more difficult to stop that violence, right? So it's important to do the education, and it's important to interrupt and stop violence from happening when it's happening, when we have that ability to do so. So I definitely agree. I think it's very valuable. We just need to be clear on what we're doing when we do educational programs. It has a long-term benefit, right? We're building toward the future without violence. And then, but in the meantime, there should be some effort to be trying to interrupt when we have the ability to interrupt and stop violence. So that would be like how I think about what you said. So it's like, yes, absolutely. And there's more that we could be doing to interrupt and stop violence.
This is what I mean. Okay, of course, we have to interrupt the violence. Okay, but we have to establish the strong base for preventing violence from the beginning.
Right. It's not either or. It's not only one or the other. Some organizations and groups within URI, they're well positioned to work on educational programming, and they're doing that, right? So we're not asking anyone to change that focus. I agree with you that that's extremely important. There are other organizations within URI that might be positioned to try to interrupt and stop violence in the moment where it's happening. And that could even include, for example, bullying in schools. Interrupting and stopping bullying in schools is also an important type of violence to prevent, right? So it can manifest itself, it can happen in lots of different ways, and preventing that violence wherever it's showing up, however it's showing up, is important, in addition to the education and a lot of the other programs that URI cooperation circles are doing around the world. I wasn't able to really get the question that was asked by the woman in the room, so I apologize. Maybe she wants to like put that in the chat or something, I'm not really sure. But I didn't want to go forward without acknowledging what Taleb said about the violence that's happening right now and the need to stop that violence, and the concern that you expressed that URI has not come out with a new statement. We did have a statement on October 7th or 8th that was released, and that already anticipated that there would likely be an escalation in violence and calling for that escalation not to happen. Obviously, that didn't happen and it didn't have any impact. Whether URI should issue another statement right now is something that is being discussed by leadership within URI, within the staff, and then there will be a discussion. There's been a discussion online, and as you know, in the contacts and in other groups about whether there should be a statement and about the efficacy, like how important is it? What would a statement by URI accomplish, right? And I think we don't know the answer to that, but we have heard from you and from other people within the network a desire, a view of the importance of URI having a new statement on this. And so I just wanted you to know that that has been heard. I'm not in a position to make that decision myself. It's not mine to make. But I did want to acknowledge that that is extremely important, and we know that to you and to other people within our network. So it's weighing very heavily on all of our hearts and on all of our minds right now. And I see you, Daniel. Hello. Yeah, so we're very aware of this. So I can't change. I don't necessarily want today's conversation to go there because we're hoping that we're going to try to like focus beyond that. But I also understand if this is what we want to discuss. So I see Shaima has their hand up.
Yes, if you allow me to say something, and I'm sorry I'm closing the camera because I'm driving. So I have a point to share that also besides the education in the schools and outside, we should also focus on how to work and to improve the supervision of the family, because always early warning, early actions are better. And unfortunately, in our regions, at least this is my perception, we have the tendency to hide if we have like violence or extremist violence in the behavior of our children, in the member of our families, with the speech, with the behaviors. Even also now we see it more and more on social medias. Also with the rise of the consumption of drugs. I don't know if you had time to discuss it in your presentation because I missed some parts. But my idea is to raise this point as it's important, and also to raise the or to put the accent on the important work of the women, because they the woman or the mother in general, because they can easily get the information from the children and analyze the behavior, so we can take early actions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions or comments right now, or should I respond there to Shaima? So I agree, women play an extremely important role in potentially interrupting and stopping violence within their families and within their communities. And it is important for everyone, man, woman, child, who has a relationship with somebody who's doing violence or has potential to do violence, has a likelihood of doing violence, to be thinking about the ways in which they can use their influence to interrupt and stop violence. So it's important that we all recognize that we walk around, everyone walks around with their own circle of influence. So we all have people that we know and trust, and that they know and trust us. And if we express something to them, they're more likely to do it than if someone who they don't know expresses something to them. So we all have, it's like a superpower to try to change people's behaviors. And it's important that we actually focus on this and not just accept this behavior, even if it's something that's being taught in the schools, and we don't have to accept everything. We can push back against norms, we can push back against behaviors, and try to change those behaviors and try to chart a new path to the future by trying to interrupt and stop that violence from happening. It could be mothers within their own family. It could be wives with the behavior of their husbands or brothers in their family, or their fathers. So women definitely have an important role to play. Are there other comments? Sahar?
I was also thinking of just the role of an individual and every single one of us here. And I was just really thinking of violence as a contagious disease. How do I protect myself from this disease? Do I isolate myself? Or if I want to have a role, how do I make sure I have a nice balance of still being in that contaminated area, but also being able to educate? Because I think right now what's happening is violence is bad if it's, sorry, I need to figure out a way to word it. Do we celebrate some acts of violence and then condemn others? But violence as a whole is a disease. So then how do we tackle that?
So thank you for raising that. I think there's two aspects of that. So one is about self-care. As if we are exposed to violence, or if we're working to try to interrupt and stop violence, and by doing so, becoming more directly, what's the word I'm looking for now? More directly impacted by violence, then we do need to take self-care measures to try whatever that means for you, right? It could just be meditation or breathing exercises or what have you. It could be removing yourself from a situation for a period of time in order to like allow yourself to decompress and to be out of that environment. Awareness is the first thing. Being aware that you are, by working on violence, you are putting yourself in a position where you're potentially being impacted by violence, right? So that awareness is extremely important as we try to navigate, especially the world today, and especially in the region where you are living, being exposed to so much violence all the time. And this isn't just starting on October 7th, this has been going on for decades. And it has an impact. It has a dramatic, traumatic impact on people's lives. And I think we all need to recognize that this is something that people are carrying around with them. And you have intergenerational violence that's passed down from individual within families. So it's a very big problem. So that's like, yes, self-care is important if you're going to choose to work on this and to put yourself in that situation. But even if you just live in the environment in which you all live right now, you are all exposed to violence. We are all exposed to violence. And I think being aware of that is extremely important in taking measures of self-care, whatever that is, to allow you to then show up as your best self, to try to do whatever it is you're doing in your communities. It's extremely important. The second part of what I heard you say, which maybe I misunderstood, but what I heard is that what do you do if like you have some kinds of violence you celebrate and some kinds that you oppose, but you oppose violence generally? My response, and this is naive, I assume, but me personally, I oppose all violence. I have never seen any act of violence that I would celebrate and think is a good thing. I kind of get what you're saying, but I think we need to try to look at violence as a bad thing. Like, there may be political objectives that you support or whatever, but I think in general, violence is bad and we should view it as bad. If we start to cut out certain exceptions where we think certain violence is good or okay and other violence isn't, then I think it becomes very difficult. Where do you draw that line? So that's a personal choice that everybody has to make. And I'm not trying to tell anyone what to do or what to believe, but I think it becomes very difficult when you accept some violence is okay and other violence is not okay. So other comments or questions? Daniel?
Yes, first, good evening to everyone. I'm glad to hear all this. I just wanted to propose that sometimes there is violence and people tend to not see it as violence because either it's within the culture aspect or like what we are seeing in Gaza, you know, all the violence that is happening in America, it's say that this is self-defense. So there's a problem in actually addressing the actual violence that is happening by giving it different names and forms. And in some maybe religions say that it is okay, it is part of being active. So I just want to highlight that not all violence is addressed as violence, even though it should be addressed and violence, and it should be condemned as well. So we need to take care of this, I think.
So I know what you're referring to, which violence you're referring to and who's not addressing it. First of all, I want to say that although I am American, I hope I don't represent, and I'm not expected to represent or take responsibility for the positions of the US government or other Americans that you might hear. So I am an individual and I'm a member of URI, and that is how I'm showing up today. I'm not here representing the US government.
Yes, I know. I
just want to make that perfectly clear.
No, I just
Other kinds of invisible violence, or not invisible, other kinds of violence that aren't recognized and called out sufficiently is structural violence, which happens and has been happening in your region, but happens also in the United States and lots of other countries all the time. And it should also be called out as violence, and it can be interrupted. I mean, you have to think differently and creatively about it, but it needs to be recognized and called out as violence, right? So I 100% agree with you that there needs to be a recognition of violence is violence is violence, right? And not some violence is okay and other violence is not okay. But I can't take responsibility for what our government is doing or other governments might be doing.
Yeah, actually, I was also thinking about that, but also thinking about the term of that goes along with Voices of Truth, that as we know that violence is violence and violence is not okay and it cannot be justified, but also our Voices of Truth should be rise more and more to people around us. And when I shared about America, I didn't mean you, but because I lived in America a total of 7 years, and I have seen how Americans or you'd be at least and even Christians by the Bible, that anything Israel is doing, it is they say that it is okay because they're the chosen people of God. Anyway, I do not want to get into all that now. I just wanted to share that the principle of violence is wrong. I mean, at least we all can agree that violence is wrong, and it needs to be addressed. And we need to address it, and we need to have higher voices of truth to expose it, even though some people might not see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other comments, questions?
We have time for maybe one more question. Then I'm here. Anyone? Comments? Or the people online? Feedback, comments, questions, remarks, everything is welcomed. Feedback.
Well, I just maybe want to take this opportunity to thank you for listening to this and to having, oh, Noifa, you want to talk?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thank you for your action with the URI. Thanks for to assure Daniel. We already have a statement about the violence in Gaza. We are clear in URI about URI statement. Only to told Daniel, Karen here is not represent US, but represent URI. URI is a global organization, not American organization, or only based in US, but it's global organization. The point of view is here is global point. For that, only to be clear, that's will be clear. Already URI do statements about Gaza. That is clear. Thank you for all.
Thank you, Nafal. And yes, Daniel and I had the opportunity to meet in person, and I know he wasn't like trying to implicate me, but I did want to make that pretty clear, so I appreciate that. Yes, so this is, I hope, the beginning of a conversation within URI MENA, and between my office, the office of that focuses on partnership and violence prevention, and cooperation circles and individuals in the MENA region who are interested in this issue of violence and want to think more deeply about how violence shows up in your community and whether and how that violence could be addressed using a health approach. And if that's something that you're interested in, we're interested in being in dialogue with you about that. So I just want to thank you for taking part of your Saturday evening to spend time talking about this and thinking about this. And just really appreciate all of you and all the work that you're doing. And I just want to recognize that there are a lot of people who know how difficult the situation is for you guys right now. And you're not alone, So, so anyway, there's a
Thank
lot
you,
of
Karen. Thank you very much for bringing this very important and very sensitive subject for, for the whole people in the region, because we still have this conflict which exists many, many years. So thank you. I know you are a great lady. You did a great presentation. And as you said, this is the beginning of conversation regarding this subject. And we hope to have another session in addition to this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank
Take
you.
care of yourselves.
And I hope all of you show solidarity with us. We are
Absolutely.
really in panic and harsh situation. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Thank you, everybody. All right.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you
care.
for
Natalia,
All right.
الله معكم بأمان الله. السلام عليكم.
Thank you. Bye-bye.